So it is with great delight that I introduce our speaker this morning, the Rev Jim Kellermann. He's a retired United Methodist minister from the Detroit Annual Conference, and his churches ranged in size from 40 to 800 members, if you can imagine. He was educated at North Central College in Naperville, Illinois, and then he received his Masters of Divinity from Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. He and his wife, Polly Strosahl, my sister, live in Green Bay, where they enjoy grandparenting as their primary vocation. Got to say, they have 4 wonderful, beautiful grandchildren. They also enjoy backpacking and traveling, which Jack and I have had the pleasure of joining with them on a few occasions. So please welcome Rev Jim Kellermann.
Am I on there? Does that do it? Yes, I am. I'm green, okay. As Amanda says, my name is Jim. My pronouns are he and him. And as she tells you, I am a United Methodist clergy, getting closer to 50 years of participation in that kind of reality, which is a way of saying that when I'm asked to speak, it has a connotation about it for one who's trained as a preacher. So I apologize up front for if that's the way you feel it comes. Take it as you will with whatever you can glean from it. But it also means that when I do preaching, I usually begin with or roll around or rotate with a scripture. So I'm going to do that with you, if you don't mind. I will tell you a story from the life of Jesus, from the Gospel of Luke, one you're probably familiar with. We recognize that Jesus is raised in Nazareth to Mary and Joseph, and there are stories about him being there and about him as a 12-year-old when he's still, that is his home base, his home is still in Nazareth. After that, there's no more stories about who he is as a child growing up, from 12 years on until his late 20s. Now we have some guesses about when he leaves Nazareth and when and where he goes. They're guesses, educated guesses, probably good educated guesses, but they're only guesses. But we do know that he reemerges in the Galilee region and encounters his distant cousin John, is baptized, and then wanders off again to do some introspection, to get clear about who he understands himself to be, and then emerges at the point where John himself is arrested and eventually beheaded. And now Jesus emerges as a rabbi, an itinerant rabbi moving through the Galilee region of Palestine. He is gets a fairly well-known reputation around the area because he teaches in a different way, a different style, a way of understanding how you live life in the context of what grounds him, and he shares that in a way that attracts people significantly, and they get excited about this new possibility of how you relate to this reality that grounds them. His itineration eventually leads him back to Nazareth. When he comes home, you recognize that from the story that they tell that the population in Nazareth recognizes him, and they've been hearing about this itinerant pastor who's got this reputation, and now discover that it's one of their homegrown kids. And you can imagine they have some pride about that. That kind of comes through the story in the way they talk about this being a child of Mary and Joseph. We're delighted to have him back. On the Sabbath, which is Jesus' practice, he shows up at the synagogue. And because he's the rabbi of note, they let him read text and comment on it, which is the rabbinical style. So he's handed the book of Isaiah, the scroll of Isaiah, and he unrolls it to the place where it says, "Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, release to the captives, and to bring liberation to those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." Now that's a primary text for the children of Abraham and Sarah across generations. Since Isaiah writes that or puts that out there, that becomes a primary focus of hope that things will change, that things will become different. You can imagine that that's a piece that they hear and listen to and are wondering what Jesus is going to say about this to unfold this. Jesus doesn't take the normal rabbinical style, however, which is to comment about it, to pull out, parse words and say, this word means that, this word means this, or this is what I've read somewhere else or someone else. He sits down and he says, today, in your hearing, this text is fulfilled. Today in your hearing, this text is fulfilled. Now the people of Nazareth are ecstatic because these people know what oppression is like, and here's somebody who's sitting in front of them saying, today you are liberated. Today you are getting economic justice. Today you are being released. That's what they hear. And so they are overwhelmed because they know oppression. They know what it's like to be oppressed. It's built into their DNA. If you read the stories that they tell about who they have been across 1,000 years or more, they are stories that are complete with a whole host of oppressions, from slavery in Egypt to deportations to Babylon, to exiles and sieges and invasions that are constant, except for a few heroic moments when there are moments of high history for them, where one of their leaders has some kind of holy reality that understands it and lives for a moment in peace. Most of their time is spent infighting or fighting with those that are pressing in, partially because they have chosen as their primary land, a land that they claim is given to them, but they have claimed it, and it happens to be the land that connects Europe and Asia and Africa. Anybody who wants to do trade between those continents is going to come through their piece of land going down to Africa. Anybody who wants to dominate an empire is going to come through their plot of land. It's the plot of land everybody wants to control. You can understand the history even today, recognizing it's that plot of land everybody wants to control. And so they are always under oppression. It comes from the Egyptians, it comes from the Babylonians, it comes from the Assyrians, it comes from the Persians, it comes from the Greeks. Eventually, and most recently, it comes from the Romans. This generation of people in Nazareth who are listening to Jesus, they know the Roman oppression. It's been their lifetime of Roman oppression. In fact, when Rome invades, they have a tendency to build Roman cities. And in Palestine, there are 7 Roman cities that are built, one of which, Bethshean, is just across the valley from Nazareth, a day's journey away. And it happens to be built by whoever the laborers they can gather up from around the surrounding communities, which are the people from Nazareth. Who builds the Roman cities? The people of Nazareth have to be taken over to Bethshean to build a series of Roman temples for a variety of gods, amphitheaters, Roman baths, rich opulent homes for the wealthy Romans who come to govern the area, rich opulent homes for the Jews who are conscripting with the Romans, and Roman streets that are laid out so that the chariots can ride on them, because it's a military base from which they can now move out into the area, including Nazareth. They know oppression. The other reality is that once you know you've built it, now they come and tell you, you've got to pay for it. You're going to be taxed to pay for all 7 of these cities. And by the way, you get to pay for that occupational military presence that's here. And you have to send money back to Rome, because Rome's only source of income is the conquered lands they get. If they don't have enough money to live the lifestyle they've gotten used to, they have to conquer somebody else to get a new tax base. This is the new tax base. These folks know oppression. So they're delighted when Jesus says, this is fulfilled in your hearing today. We are liberated. We are getting economic justice today. And then Jesus says, well, not quite. See, he says, what he says is prophets in their hometown are never listened to, are never respected, which is to say, you're not listening to what I just said to you. You see, what he says is, I said, today, in your hearing, this text is fulfilled. We usually think that means today, in this moment, the moment I'm hearing this, it's fulfilled. That's the way they took it. Jesus means today, as you hear it, you become responsible for preaching good news to the poor. You become responsible for declaring release to the captives. You become responsible for liberation. You become responsible for economic justice. Suddenly, the Nazarenes are not so happy with Jesus. In fact, if you read the rest of the story, it says they kind of get perturbed by him and they want to take him and throw him off the cliff, literally. That's how angry they get. But Jesus is right. Responsibility for justice is yours. It's mine. It doesn't begin when we tell somebody in another place, you've got to do justice, not when they've got to change something they're doing. It's us. We're the ones that initiate. We're the ones who respond to. We're the ones who enact the realities of justice. And when that happens, then justice occurs. Some 50, some plus 60 years ago, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, remember those names? They organized the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee. And they did so on having read Mahatma Gandhi. They used Gandhian principles of nonviolence, which I can imagine the owners of the crops that they were picking said, this is a weak union. They have no guts. They have no teeth. They can't do anything. They're nonviolent. And workers like this are a dime a dozen. There was no immigration controversy at the border. So these people don't want to work. They're expendable. We'll go down to Mexico and get more. Nice and easy. So there was no problem for the growers to have nonviolent union, except that because they did it nonviolently, they started telling this story about having incomes that were so low that even the children had to work in the fields and the farms because they couldn't afford to make ends meet unless everybody in the family was a picker. So nobody got to go to school. There was no health care. So if you got sick, we're not going to take care of you. Housing was poor. Everything was just horrendous for the farm workers. And because they were doing it nonviolently and started telling this story, there happened to be some folks who said, this doesn't sound like it's just and fair. Folks like UU fellowships, folks like the United Methodist Church, United Methodist Women, folks across a whole bunch of mainline churches and Roman Catholic Church, and they started saying, this isn't right. And so they said, we'll boycott. We'll boycott grapes. We'll boycott lettuce. They looked at their dining room table and said, this food on our table is being picked and grown by people who are living in subhuman reality. And how can I eat this? So we stopped buying it. And eventually the growers realized our profit margin just collapsed. We've got people picking because they're nonviolent, they're not doing anything, they're picking the stuff for us, but we can't sell it. So now the profit margin drops, and now they come to the table to negotiate. The next reality was, I don't know if you remember this, and some of you would remember this, it was tomatoes. They went to the tomato crops, and we said, oh yeah, we'll start boycotting tomatoes. And they said, no, you're buying tomatoes as small potatoes. The real folks who buy tomatoes are going to be McDonald's and Burger King and folks who do canning. So those are the products you need to look at. So it became not a boycott of the product. It was a secondary boycott. Don't go to McDonald's. You better believe that McDonald's immediately said, oh, well, then we'll only buy the tomatoes from growers. That boycott did not last long because they recognized the economic impact. They knew what it did to grapes and lettuce. They knew what it was going to do to their profit margin too. So you and I sat down at our table and we said justice is connected with what we eat here, with how they're picking the stuff out in the fields out in California, and then across Ohio Valley and down into Florida, wherever these products were being picked. Now, I can't say that farm workers now have a wonderful life. Justice is still unruly for them in many ways. But you see what happens when you and I take responsibility for justice. My brother Billy, my older brother, married Jeannie Wiley. The two of them had two little girls, Lydia and Lucy, and they raised them to be a family of justice. Their vocation was justice. They were part of what was called the Detroit Peace Community, which was part of an interwoven connection of peace communities across the country and around the world. And the two of them, my brother and sister-in-law, were authors. They wrote books about justice. They wrote books that encouraged nuclear armament resistance. They wrote, my sister-in-law was the editor of the radical Episcopal newspaper that pushed justice issues constantly. It was their vocation. They're the ones who are in the midst of the water crises in Detroit and in Flint, and are arguing for water as a human right, and the politics around that, about Black Lives Matter. These are folks who are steeped in justice. It's how they raise their kids. When we raised our kids and got to a weekend, we were trying to figure out how to get our son to the baseball game that he was in, Little League, or how to get my daughter to the soccer game she was playing. They were showing up with their kids at Wurtsmith Air Force Base and doing actions against the planes that fly the nuclear weapons that are our first line of defense in the UP, and resisting that, doing trespass actions, getting arrested. And my nieces were raised in a community that had that expectation. Unfortunately, my brother's wife, Jeannie, died very young from a glioblastoma, a brain tumor, and left these two still school-age children with Billy to raise. And he continued to raise them in this style. So it wasn't a surprise that when Lydia, the oldest, graduated from Loyola of Chicago, she came to my brother and said, "Dad, I'm going to Palestine and accompany children to school, and then I'm going to stand in protest with the Palestinians." Now, this was about 15 years ago. I'm not sure about the age, but about 15 years ago, give or take. And you need to know that at that moment in time, Israel decided that the best defense they had was to build a wall between themselves and the Palestinians. And they built the wall, but they didn't build it on an Israeli land. Israel wanted to build the wall, but they wanted to build it on the Palestinian land. And so the Palestinians were being cut off from their olive groves. They were being cut off from the fields where their flocks grazed. They were being cut off from their schools. They were being cut off from health care. They were being cut off from their other members of their family. The wall was an act of violence. And people were ignoring it until folks from around the world started showing up and saying, this is a violent thing. And Lydia's intent was to go because the school children had to walk around the wall that was being built to get to school. And the wall was being protected by the Israeli military with drawn weapons all the time. And in order to get the children to school safely, they had to be accompanied. And then someone had to wait there and bring them home at night to make sure they got back to their homes. And so she was going to do that and then stand in protest. Now that's what the intent was, and that's what she actually ended up doing. But when Billy heard this, his first response, and I think he says this tongue-in-cheek because he knows his daughter, he knows how she's raised, and he knows that this is stuff he used to do. And so when she came to him, he said, "Isn't this the kind of thing you should come and ask permission from your father to do?" He said there was a father's heart in that too, who was caring about his daughter. But her response was, "Dad, when you baptized me, you gave me permission. When you baptized me, you gave me permission." Now, I recognize UU doesn't do baptism as a rite, and I that's fine. But I want you to know that in the United Methodist Church and in a lot of mainline churches, the language for the last 50 years that we've used in the questions we ask as you come to baptism and then eventually confirmation, that one of the questions is, will you resist evil and oppression and injustice in whatever forms and guises they present themselves? Hear that question? Will you resist evil, oppression, and injustice in whatever forms and guises it presents itself? And you say yes to that to be baptized, and which means Lydia is absolutely wrong. She does not have permission to do justice. She's required to do justice by her baptism. It's built into who she is, not just by the way she's raised in the family, but by the commitment she's made in some kind of spiritual integrity she has in her baptism. I recognize, as I say, that this is not a rite that you practice, but hearing and reading what you say and do, you say this. It may not be a baptismal rite, but it is at the heart of who you are, who you define yourself to be. You don't have a choice. If you belong to this fellowship, this is who you are. This is what you do. Can I do one more? Okay. One more. My son and daughter-in-law live about 17 minutes away from us, which is why we retired to Green Bay so that we could watch grandchildren grow up. They chose to live in De Pere, a suburb of Green Bay, because of the school system. Absolutely wonderful school system. One of the highest rated school systems in Green Bay. I think it's probably one of the highest rated school systems in the state, among that top tier set of school systems, which means everybody, like my daughter and son-in-law, or son and daughter-in-law, would like to move to De Pere because they realize that it's a good school system, a good education, and so people move into De Pere. But you have to understand, De Pere has a higher level of property value for the most part, and so the number of people who can come into that school system is marked by an economic line, which has racial connotations to it. So that the school system in which they participate is predominantly Caucasian. Handful of African Americans, a couple of other nationalities represented, but primarily Caucasian. My daughter thought about moving this direction, but she was more concerned about the social reality than about the education of the quality of the education, because she thought, I can get this level of education, but this level of social stuff, I'd rather shift to those. So she was even contemplating going to the Green Bay school systems, which have predominant racial context to it. So to get that kind of balance. But in De Pere, that's the way it comes. And it doesn't, you're just on a day-to-day basis, you're not aware of that until my grandson came home and started telling them stories about his friend, who happened to be one of the African Americans, who said he walks down the hall and this is in middle school, and he's being called names that are unacceptable. He's being isolated. He's being pushed aside. He's ostracized because of who he is, and both Noah and Kelsey began to have questions about that, and in conversation with the parents, they realized the parents of that African American youth who could go to the principal or go to the superintendent and say, this stuff is happening, but they weren't the folks who could drive any kind of change in the school system. The change had to come from white privileged folks like my daughter-in-law and my son. So she started driving it. She started gathering it together folks she knew had a common interest in justice, a common understanding of how we share life together, and began pulling together this community of folks talking about how we can enrich the lives of our kids so they have an understanding of a different way of living together. And they tried to start a club in middle school. Because the middle school is only 2 years, it kind of goes fast, so it didn't take hold. But they were working on trying to get a club formed that allowed for open and everybody gets to join kind of reality, and to talk about it and to model a different way of being. But they continued to be together. continue to talk about the issues that are happening in this, for justice in this school system. Last year, as happened across the state of Wisconsin and across the country, and I apologize if this is offensive to somebody, there were a couple of individuals who chose to run for school board who came from the mega right. And they came with the idea that they would control their educational process so their children were protected from issues and things that they didn't think were appropriate. So these are the folks who although the school system never had anybody, I think one book in 15 years has ever been questioned in the libraries, they said, we're going to build a policy that dictates how we let books into the library. We don't trust the librarians to do that anymore. And so they were pushing for some kind of reality around constricting the subject matter in the library. And these are the folks who would say, Black history, look, we only have one or two people who are African American in this community. Why should we teach Black history? American history has been good for 200 years. Just the fact that it's written by all the white people doesn't mean anything. So they're wanting to restrict that. And then the last one was, why there are some classrooms that are displaying a rainbow flag. We don't think that flag should be there because our kids have to deal with something we think is inappropriate for them to hear or talk about. We don't agree with that. We want those flags out of there. Who shows up at the school board meeting are Kelsey and that circle of friends she's been gathering around to say, that flag there represents everybody. That flag there allows somebody to understand that their being, even if it's only 2 or 3 people, their being is respected. They have a place where they can come where it's safe to talk about who they think they might be. That's the only flag that they can come to find that in. And so she keeps pushing back. And because she knows justice doesn't happen because you sit back and say, gee, I hope somebody does something about that. It happens because she says, I'm going to go to the school board meeting. I'm going to tell them what I think about this. And you hear my love and my admiration for my daughter-in-law. All that is to say, I haven't told you anything new about justice. I haven't told you anything you didn't know when you walked in here. So I'm sorry about that. But all I'm saying is who you are and what you are at your core is to be a people of justice, to be a people who will not accept anything less than that, and that you will be the ones who will initiate it. You'll be the ones who will look for it. You'll be the ones who will call for it. And don't stop doing it because you are the ones who are called to preach good news to the poor. You are the ones who are called to release the captives. You are the ones who are called to bring liberation to those who are oppressed. You are the ones who are called to bring economic justice. It doesn't happen unless you do it. So be it. Thank you.